Thank you so much for being here. My name is Jason Rodriguez. I'm the co-founder, CEO of Zpryme and Frolic, and got an amazing group of thought leaders up here to talk about a subject you've all heard about today, but we're going to dive deeper a little bit. So with that, let's get our panelists up here. If you don't mind coming to the stage, John, Jigyasa, and Brian Dillard. Is John Speirs? Oh, there he is. Come on up. Yeah. I'm going to grab a chair. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lee. Hopefully the sign doesn't blow away, but if it does, that's completely okay. So, Brian, thanks for joining us. I think a lot of the folks here know you. But I'd like to have John, if you don't mind, just introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about the work you do and your organization.
Good afternoon. My name is John Speirs with Harris County. I am the broadband manager. Our objective is to advance broadband infrastructure in the region. The priority is to do that through the lens of digital equity and building a coalition to advance the tremendous opportunities that our community can gain from additional capacity. So this is something that is really a lot of co-creation and work going into that. We'll talk about that. But formerly I was with the City of Austin doing similar work. And this is really a great way to roll up my sleeves again and be here in my new home.
Oh, thank you. And Jigyasa?
Hello. Yeah, okay, this mic is working. Hello, everyone. My name is Jigyasa Sharma, and I'm a program manager with US Ignite. And you have heard from my amazing boss, Lee Davenport, in the morning. So US Ignite, we are a nonprofit based in DC, but I get to work from San Francisco, which is great. And we work with a network of over 50 communities, and we work on all things smart cities. So from digital equity, which is sort of a big area for us, to EV, AV, and pretty much every topic that we have heard from all the great speakers in the morning. So yeah, that's pretty much about me, and I'm excited to talk about equity and resilience. I do want to add that this is a terrific venue as a participant, not so as a speaker. So if I look distracted, I'm probably just admiring something. So bring me back, Jason. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And Brian, just a quick, I know most know you, but go ahead if you don't mind.
Brian Dillard, Chief Innovation Officer, City of San Antonio. We work with all 40+ departments across the City of San Antonio, whether it be performance excellence, digital inclusion, smart cities, or our brand new research and development team. Happy to be here.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. So I want to start with Brian and John here. So resilience and equity, they seem to be intertwined in the conversations, and they're converging a lot. And it's almost like you really can't have one without the other. And I think we've heard a lot of that today from the speakers. But so I wanted to start with you, Brian, on this one, and then John, if you don't mind chiming in, is how do you guys and your team approach resilience, and then what are those gaps in there when you look at this? If you're looking at transportation, if you're looking at utilities, city services, because there's a whole lot of angles you can go down, a lot of rabbit holes chasing those. But how do you guys prioritize that and identify which ones need to be met? And then John, if you don't mind chiming in.
Yeah, honestly, we try to identify what's coming up on the horizon for our most underserved residents. A lot of that, years ago, we started off with digital inclusion. We've had a digital inclusion alliance in San Antonio for several years now. The city, of course, public libraries activated on it, but we didn't really take it as a priority until around 2019, and that was built out of smart cities. We realized as we were doing all the smart city stuff, all this cool stuff, that we really needed to identify, do our residents actually have connectivity to affordable, dependable internet service? That's where we kind of got started with that, and we've built on that as we move forward. We've got actually got a chief housing officer at the City of San Antonio now. We identified that as a big gap in resiliency. We started up, our office helped start up our workforce development office a couple of years ago because we knew there was a shortage in workforce. And then, honestly, we're trying to identify funding. That's the big piece right now. We're all in a kind of cushy space because of federal funding and state funding from ARPA and recovery resiliency. That's going away quickly. So our next step is really identify how are we going to sustain this broadening of government services in the midst of losing those big buckets of funding.
So in Harris County, similar to what Brian is working on in San Antonio, really looking at our organizational capabilities to advance broadband infrastructure. And this is something that we're looking at those core services that Harris County supports, both statutorily and priorities from our Commissioner's Court. Transportation infrastructure, number one. It's really easy to plug in empty conduit when you're digging up the right-of-way. This is something that then can support that additional build-out for generations to come. When we're looking at our electric vehicle charging infrastructure as well, a really easy win for empty conduit to be plugged in for those networked chargers. And for our flood resilience. For those visitors here, this is an area that is prone to flooding and hurricanes. Natural disasters are something that is really a part of our DNA. And we need to plan for that. How resilient is our constituents when those disasters happen? How can technology better their experience through that so that they stay connected, that they can connect with emergency responders, and enable the opportunity to alert the public safety officials when there's an issue that they need to respond to now. All of those things are important for the county to then take a step back and look regionally. This is a massive region, 7.5 million residents within this region. And when we look at the region from the coastline to the area that's starting to get into our hill country, it's a vast geography with a diverse population. So those needs really vary across our municipalities and counties. And we've just started this journey on our regional approach, and something that we hope will also gain additional insight through that on what are those priorities that those cities and counties want to see from additional broadband build-out.
And Jigyasa, you guys work with several partners, so I want to see if you could maybe talk a little about, are there any projects specifically like in highly dense urban areas where this blend of equity and resilience projects or technologies you guys are looking to work with, and how that may be making or be able to contribute to a positive impact to some of the challenges that both John and Brian laid out?
Sure, Jason. So I think, I think John and Brian here can add a lot from the city perspective. What I would like to start with first, before I touch on some of the projects that we have been working on, is sort of just provide a little bit of a theoretical and a policy grounding to our discussion. So I think, so to address first, what are the gaps in equity and resilience? I think the gap lies in our very understanding of how we approach equity and resilience. And I'm being very intentional when I say equity before resilience, because I believe that equity is the means as well as the prerequisite to building resilient and sustainable cities, right? So that is number one. Now, I've been in spaces where it's really difficult to talk about equity, right? Because it's more than just giving equal opportunities, right? It's more than just connecting, giving access to everyone, right? It's more about creating a level playing field for everyone in our community. It's about having the courage to talk about things like power privilege that exist. It's important to talk about identity, and identity is very tricky. We can have different identities, and how they intersect with each other makes equity even more complicated. So I get it when people find it a little unsettling to talk about equity. So here's how I think about it. I think the way we should approach equity is to tell ourselves that we as a community or we as a collective society will be better off only when the most vulnerable in our communities are better off, right? So thinking about that when we are doing our smart city projects, be it on digital divide, be it on AV, EV, mobility, I think that is where we need to set our heart at, right? Now, coming to resilience, I love the panel right before this, and we were talking about disruption, we were talking about homeostatic equilibrium, and I think that really leads into the point of resilience because, as we know, resilience is sort of the ability of ecosystems to adapt to changing environment, right? And we often do the mistake of thinking that there is this certain balance or equilibrium we are trying to hit, when in reality there is no steady state we are trying to get back to, right? Resilience is a lot about economic resiliency. It's not just climate, it's economic, social, institutional. And so what we are trying to aspire for is this simultaneous multiple equilibria that can exist in all these different aspects of urban resiliency. So I think it's important to understand that we cannot just talk about tech without thinking about our communities or without thinking about the economy, right? So there is sort of this complex interplay that is going on. And then I think Ricky brought up yoga in the morning. So I practice yoga, and that got me thinking that actually cities can learn a lot from yoga, right? And so I without going for too long about yoga, because I can talk about it for hours, I just want to say that one of the practices in yoga is intentionality, and that is what is needed. In one of the panels, someone said tech is only as good as the values underpinning it. So I think it's so important to set that intention and those values that we are trying to aspire for in all the smart city projects that we are doing. Yeah.
And John, you've had a chance to work in Austin, and then you come to Houston. You maybe point to some of those successes and maybe some of the partners involved and how you got to those successes in regard to either the broadband side or they're working when tying in resilience and equity into those projects.
So, from the comments on the previous panel, partnership and collaboration need to be a part of that DNA for these efforts. The principle to advance digital equity within this work is an important frame because that sets the priorities that we're working from. And from the public-private partnership lens, our commercial sector has a lot to gain because those underrepresented populations are really the consumers that are the hardest to sell to for our commercial sector, the hardest to design for, the hardest to account for. And so we're able to essentially evaluate that long end of the tail when it comes to a consumer product or something that can scale through this work. So it becomes a test bed, a pilot, a prototype, rapid prototyping. And this is really where a mix of partners is not only essential, it's critical. Broadband needs a use case, and those use cases need that lived experience to help us ensure that we're prioritizing equity.
Thank you. And Brian, you've made equity and inclusion like a pillar of since you started. I've been fortunate to know that work. But even through that, right, and even your background in working in community organizing, who's still not at the table that's not in this audience, or maybe it's not going to these, that one is like an industry events, but also who's not at a table from a community perspective that we need to do a better job of getting involved. And that doesn't have to be specific to San Antonio. That could be to us here as practitioners.
Honestly, we're reflecting now on that, and our team is, honestly, City of San Antonio is doing an amazing job at bringing folks to the table, making sure they have a seat at the table. The missing piece, I feel like, from my vantage point, is the orchestration of that conversation. Is everybody actually talking to each other, or are we just here at the table and we're in our silos still? That's the next piece of this, is really trying to identify how do we strategically move forward in these conversations, and not just in the conversations, but the actions that we're taking as an ecosystem. From geekdom to Joint Base San Antonio to the City of San Antonio, how are we continuously having dialogue among each other about what movements we are making in the current state, and then what's our next steps, so that way we're doing this together in a comprehensive manner, not only for efficiency, but for the effectiveness and impact to the resident.
I cannot, there are so many programs, and without getting too much into the specifics of some of the projects, I think there are two sort of, I want to call it ingredient or aspects that I think are sort of important for every city to think about when they are thinking about equity and resilience. And one is civic trust, right? So according to Assessor report, 80% of the smart city pilots fail to scale, and about 2/3 of all smart city projects fail, right? So when we came across this statistic at US Ignite, we started to ask the question as like, what is happening? There's clearly something that's going wrong, and there is some sort of like a paralysis in decision making of policymakers, and we were curious to find out what sort of is causing, why are so many smart city projects set up for failure. And we realized that, when smart city projects fail, it severely undercuts civic trust, right? So we came up with a framework where we proposed that there are 5 policy domains, and them being data governance, privacy, cybersecurity, community engagement, and equity, that sort of come together to form an ecosystem of trust, right? And we talked about resilience when we were developing the guide, and we agreed that resilience and sustainability are sort of outcomes of creating, when we create sort of that ecosystem of trust, right? So number one is, of course, keeping civic trust in mind. And the second thing I would say is the civic design. There was a very interesting report that came out recently from the Smart Growth America. It's called Foot Traffic Ahead. And it ranked 35 metropolitan cities in America. And it found out that only some 1.8% of the total landmass in these 35 metropolitan countries are walkable. And some 98.8% of it's actually illegal to make walkable urban spaces because of restrictive zoning requirements, right? They also found that walkable spaces helped cities generate more revenue, expand their tax base, also helped in easing the housing crisis, and made cities resilient. So I think there is a need to really think about the civic design to create more walkable spaces. And I've actually written a blog around that, which is going to be published soon, I think next week with Zpryme. So yeah, I'm going to stop there so you guys can read the blog and learn more.
All right, thank you. And John, with regard to like resilience, I was talking to Jesse last night, and just the unique like history you've learned. The city of Houston and the residents in this region have just learned to be resilient just by being exposed to severe weather for much longer than some of us Texans and then San Antonians have. So how is that factored into, I'm sure it's embedded in the foundation of your planning, but looking forward, how does that, you counter that with just the challenges you just mixed? Like, how are you guys looking to address those issues? And like, what's the next severe event you guys, that keeps you up at night?
So I've never learned so much about soil testing as much as I have through the work to plan a middle mile network. Thank you, Lee, for the insights on how to do that. This is something that really, that component to really ensure that our infrastructure is future ready and future proof really needs to depend on that, our climate change and all that's going into that. Because here in Houston and the greater Gulf Coast, we have very clay soil that is brittle when it gets hot, and it breaks. And there, you can see the conditions of our roads. No fault to the city of Houston; it's just the way it is here. So that's something that when we look at our infrastructure, incorporating that climate resiliency into the design is important. One of the notes that we have, though, is through that work, we need to operationalize that. And this is something that we're going to have to prioritize. It will require a shift in mindset for our organization to really understand what sort of further maintenance and evaluations are needed of infrastructure to protect it from climate change. And that's something that moves us from keeping the lights on to a much more proactive approach. That's going to require insight, ideas, and innovation from the commercial sector to help us do that, and to shift mindsets and go through that process to probably break things a few times and disrupt how we're currently doing that so that we're really creating something that is able to last generations.
And Brian, just after living that, right, it probably just seems like yesterday between the electric utility, the water utility in San Antonio, and having San Antonians go through that, how has that changed or did it impact the work you're doing with your partner?
It hasn't. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. You know, we focus a lot more on it. We talk a lot about it, especially this whole climate change thing. But Lee, you hit it on the head earlier about it's still a niche thing. We have an Office of Sustainability. They do an amazing job. They've got a lot of passion behind them. They have a climate action adaptation plan that's been in place for years now. But the funding, the investment to execute on it is missing because it's still a niche thing. It is not the economic development. It's not bringing in revenue, it's at least to, you know, some decision makers. And until that kind of goes the other way and we do focus on long-term investments regarding sustainability, we can talk about all that we want, but we're not putting our money where our mouth is. Luckily, our Office of Sustainability just got a huge amount of investment, but it was from the federal level. As a city, we're still not making the decision to invest as much as we should, or at least invest as much focus. Our budgets are focused on public safety, streets, and sidewalks. Sustainability gets a small chunk of that. And so, yes, we focus on a lot more since that, but the investment there still needs to be increased greatly.
Oops, okay. So I actually read this article recently where Austin has sort of set aside some $3 million in funding from the ARPA money to set up a pilot for Community Resilience Hub. So they are piloting, I believe, 5 hubs, and then they plan to scale it to up to 30. So I think that is sort of like this. I don't think it's a new idea, but it's sort of like catching a lot of momentum because I've heard Seattle is doing it, Portland is doing it. And then in Texas, I've heard about Austin, and maybe you guys can tell me more about the other cities. Sort of the idea of Community Resilience Hub is sort of creating these facilities, buildings, or infrastructure that can sort of be the backbone of the community, you know, in a crisis. So, you know, and these sort of, they are sort of anchor institutes which are also meant to be places of like gathering and coming together in sort of like normal days. So they are meant to serve as sort of like these spaces for community building during normal days, but then also as places of distributing resources, helping, sharing information, in a case of a crisis or a disaster, and then help with recovery as well. So I'm actually very interested to see where that goes and how that can help communities with better, you know, disaster preparedness and response. Yeah, I mean, we're yet to see how that goes. So, yeah.
Making sure I'm back on, but thank you there. Yeah, wanted to definitely get some feedback on the community resilience hubs because we're seeing that, hearing a lot more of that in our own research. And Brian or John, have any thoughts on
that? We work closely with our sustainability director in the county to support the efforts for those sustainability hubs. The ability for broadband to really play a component of that. The piece that we're looking at is really the wireless connectivity. So there's a few grants that we have underway that are incorporating the wireless capability into that. But it's so much more than that when it comes to the use case. And this is something that we know that we need to actually incorporate some of that work with our climate justice planning committee that has also been stood up so that those wireless or those resilience hubs are really located where they need to be, where there's a need, and not necessarily in a community that is connected in times of emergency. And so that is something that a lot of work needs to be done on that, and it's going to require a lot of buy-in and co-creation with our community partners to help us ensure that these are meeting the needs for what they're intended for.
We learned a big lesson. Someone spoke about it earlier about putting like innovation zones or testing zones in the right areas that kind of identify like what needs you need to meet. We didn't do that years ago. When the Smart Cities program was set up within the city, they identified 3 innovation zones: medical center, downtown, and then down at Brooks. I'll say they were kind of politically chosen at the end of the day. There were council members vying for them, and there was damn near 10 of them because we got 10 council members, but they scaled it back to 3. But as we started to reflect on that, as we built out the program, they weren't in the areas we needed them. Brooks was probably the most pivotal part because it was kind of start from scratch. It was live, work, play, stay. But we really needed to tap into those areas that were underserved. That's really where we need to be solving the problems at. We need to be solving at the lowest level when it comes to equity and kind of poverty levels. That way you can build up everywhere else as a reflection of that. So when it comes to community resiliency hubs, we're an example of we went really quick, and we should have taken some time to really assess our decision before we made it.
I think we have discussed quite a bit about engaging the community in smart city efforts and resilience and equity. I just want to add one thing, and I think Jesse made this point, touched on it a little bit. Community engagement is a spectrum, right? Like not every project needs the highest level of engagement, right? So if there is a ladder of participation that I would want to tell cities that you should aspire to move on. So it's like inform, consult, involve, and empower, right? That's the ladder. So let's be very realistic. It's very time consuming and it's very resource intensive to do community engagement. So while being a big proponent of community engagement, I do want to say that cities should be realistic and really identify a project and map it to the level of community engagement that is actually required, right? Because we have seen examples where over-communication or premature communication has actually harmed communities rather than benefiting them, right? We saw that in one of our overcome communities where they started the pre-sale efforts before proving the technology for how they're going to connect the unconnected, and that there were so many delays, and then people were just waiting, and they wanted the service, and that led to this feeling of dissatisfaction, and it again undercuts trust. So while community engagement is very important, I think we also need to focus on where are we on the spectrum. And second, making sure it's very timely, right? Those are my 2 cents on community engagement.
Thank you. And Brian, start on this. What are 1 or 2 technologies that you're really excited about that can be a part of really delivering on some of those end goals that to seeing better affordability, sustainability, or equity? Like, what are you excited about there in San Antonio?
I think it's technology that provides a dialogue with the community. So I think providing information to the community. So we're looking at a company right now where we can have built environment components that are accessible and informative to residents on new things that are being built out, whether it be complete streets or new technology put up on a light post. I think that's one, is putting information out, but then also being more inclusive of information coming in. We're talking a lot about community engagement. We give our residents a lot of survey fatigue because every month there's a new survey, whether there's a budget survey, a digital inclusion survey, yada, yada. And so a lot of times cities are apologetic about that. I'm trying to find ways to make that more constant. I think it should be an expectation that community members have a constant conversation with public local government. You're paying us, It should be a dialogue back and forth continuously. Figuring out what that format is and figuring out how to make that as easy and accessible for residents is something that we're building into. That's a little less technology and more trying to figure out the social aspect of it. How do we make surveys a little easier for folks rather than being all convoluted? But I think that's really what we're looking to is as we deploy all the cool stuff, how do we understand whether it's working or not for the residents that we're deploying it to?
And John, obviously, like, guys are fully all in on the broadband side, but what are those wraparound technologies that help supercharge that deployment?
To Brian's point, the ability for our organization to serve as a catalyst or as an enabler to better connect with our community to address their needs is really important. So truly wrap around, because this is something that I'm not sure that we know of what the future holds for us as far as those technology advancements 15 years down the road. This is really something that government as well is in a churn right now, moving away from paper, going digital, trying to, and something that we also need to catch up to current day. And as a part of that, we're going to need to determine that path forward to better connect with our constituents. And really from the frame of outcomes is important, because that really gets to the principle of wraparound. One of our coalitions within the county that we've stood up is an engagement and outreach network. And why we did the work to stand up this network is it helps us enable the opportunity to connect with those target populations, because we have over, thus far, 60 staff from 20 plus departments, a part of that network, that all have a direct constituent interface, whether it's public health services, tax services, and work that is really involved in those wraparound services. So for the work ahead, the best is yet to come. And I think that for us to really enable the opportunity to create pilots and prototypes for what that future may hold, I think is really important.
Thank you. And Jigyasa, I'd like you to take a stab at this one, and again, it's a big one. All these data, everyone's asking for your data feed, and we all know who would benefit, right? All of us, we all want to do good with the data for the most part, but with an equity lens, looking through it, how do you see us addressing that challenge? And then are there any companies or use cases or projects you can point to that we can maybe take some positive lessons learned of to do good with data?
Yeah, so before I go to that, let me address my hot take on data. So, well, I don't think it's an asset, right? I think much like wisdom, which is like wisdom is not power, wisdom in use or knowledge in use is power. And data is pretty similar, right? Just data is actually more of a liability than asset to any city. But once we understand what we can put the data, what use we can put that data to, and hopefully that use is a very ethical one, that is where the true power is, right? So I want to make that very clear. Just data for the sake of data is not an asset. It's a big, big liability to the cities, right? So that's number one. Number two, I think on the future of transportation panel, we heard the data, and I just love that. I think Tamika made a very important point of being able to distinguish between data-driven versus data-informed, right? We as cities need to be data-informed, but we may not necessarily, we have to choose, right, on what projects we can be data-driven, and we can let data make the decision. And I think coping with COVID was a great example, because we were just trying to look and look at the data and follow the science and do the right thing to protect our community. But when we tackle a lot of issues related to equity, just blindly following data may not be the right thing, because we all know that even the data that we have already talked about the quality of data being very bad, and then not just that, we also know there is sort of this inbuilt bias in the data. So, garbage in, garbage out. You cannot allow a biased data set to make decisions. Of course, you're going to make biased decisions, right? So there's a need to sort of understand that distinction between data-informed and data-driven, right? And so on my third point, to give you some examples, I think San Antonio has done a great job with the Equity Atlas. I love that they have that mapped so that they can identify where the investments are going and who are they actually benefiting, right? I think San Antonio and Austin, they both have this budget equity assessment tool, which actually is a pretty interesting tool to help the community see the budget investments that are being made, how are they benefiting or even burdening some of the communities. And I think that's a great example. The other great example that I always like to talk about is Portland. I'm just fascinated by the work that they do there. I think they have done a solid job with community engagement. They are doing great in terms of both civic trust and civic design, the two things that I talk about. So yeah, if you really want to look forward, look for examples, I think Portland is the place to look. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to open it up to some questions here. We have some time, and I'd love to hear some audience questions. If we got one, please, Ricky will come around and get that to you. Lee.
Lee, you can't throw a softball question up here because your colleague's here.
This question has not been planted. So.
I appreciate the shout outs, but the way that I think that we have trouble understanding resilience is that we think about it as some kind of future benefit, right? So where cities I think have done better is by framing it as a risk, right? So what's the risk to the community, to the population, to the business corridor? Have you had success thinking about and framing risk, and under what circumstances that work?
No, because it's not instant gratification. I'm being recorded, right? I have someone coming up to me. We're launching this roadmap. We've got a lot of things from public safety to transportation to sustainability, and we identify what happens if we don't invest in these things or at least focus on them. And what I got back was, you should do this tourist tracker. They want us to track people using their cell phones through the city to identify where they're going. And this is an economic thing. And I'm like, damn it, man, can I get you to focus? It's the instant gratification that always comes to the forefront. It's a squirrel thing. And then we're really trying to get past that. I've been pushing to our city manager that we really need to hire on a chief strategy officer at the city manager level, because they are just distracted by fires. Willingly so, that makes sense. They're managing those fires across 40 plus departments, so it's understandable that they're stretched thin, but they really need somebody up there that continues to push that message and doesn't get distracted by the hot topic of the moment. That's gonna happen at a council level for us, and we're strong manager city, we're not strong mayor. But it has a lot of influence. So I wish I could say that it has helped. We'll continue doing that. We'll continue that fight. But it hasn't helped that much. Yeah. You got to get in trouble with me now.
I know. I'm trying to frame this. It's either going to be analog or complete contrast to what Brian has said. But, a similar experience in that we have just started the conversation around assessing risk to the enterprise. I report to our CIO, Sindhu Menon, who's a rock star. And this is something that our approach to supporting our IT strategy will help us be together, have a strategy to engage our community, and do the work that we need to do in broadband. And this is something that we've just started to tee up. What does risk mean to us? And starting to frame the projects that we support as an enterprise around risk. I'm not sure what the methodology was before the administration that I'm a part of that is now kind of developing this path forward, but something that is important because to Brian's point, that economic driver, that instant gratification, That has kind of been a part of the lexicon for the work of digital equity, digital inclusion, and broadband, but it's so much more than that. And so this is something that, how do we collectively develop an assessment and evaluation and criteria for risk? Because it means different things to different stakeholders, but there's an opportunity as well for a collective buy-in to that. It's not just the enterprise evaluating the risk internally. For those projects that will have a direct interface with constituents, we also need to have them be a part of that risk assessment.
Next question. Someone else have a question?
Hello, my name is Alan Garza, coming out of San Antonio, Texas. I'm with Evolution Solutions. We're a system integration and a technology deployment company. We've been a 3-year startup company in our own R&D, trying to figure out how we're going to introduce new technology. One specifically we're talking about is wireless EV charging. So we'll be bringing the first wireless EV charger to Texas. We also have another technology partner called Traxel, who's innovating a new seamless, more safer way to install fiber optic for small communities. So my dilemma, my question is that I've been trying to figure out is, we're talking about introducing new technologies, all these new innovations, and bringing them to more disadvantaged communities, correct? And so my dilemma is, okay, from a stakeholder standpoint, and then from the city standpoint and equity standpoint, like it's almost counterproductive, because how we're gonna bring a wireless EV charger to an area where maybe there's no EV chargers to that area, right? Or how we're gonna, bring this new technology where, they're not quite ready for it, but yet, wherever they are ready for it, it's like, okay, it's gonna create that same, I don't know the words for it, but it's not gonna give the equity that we're looking for. So I'm just wondering, any ideas where y'all see the gap happening? The last solution I had is like say for the digital divide, and we want to bring fiber everywhere. My solution is like, these ISPs are gonna have to sacrifice something, come together, and all gonna have to sacrifice and maybe come together to work together to bridge that digital divide. But I'm just wondering, us as a startup company trying to introduce this, like how are we really gonna do this with the equity being at a high point, So any thoughts or brainstorming?
Yeah, and we talked in DC for a little bit about this, but even in the pockets where it's not a high equity area, or low equity, yeah, we've got Brooks, as I mentioned, on the south side. There's a high need there, and they've got a mix of income levels. So some of those folks, they're gonna get to that income level where they need it. I would say for something like that, it's often easier just to work with the private entities, work directly with Brooks or Port SA or Boeing or Joint Base San Antonio. If you're not, because not every revenue stream is going to be dependent on equity. That's just not realistic. And so I think that's where it's at. Now, with the investment from like a local government side, specifically one that's focused on equity, there's still some space there. I think it meets our marks on sustainability. But as I just mentioned, are we investing in sustainability right now? So it's kind of one of those areas that it's not on fire. Electric vehicles, that topic isn't a hot topic right now. It is going to be before we know it. But right now, we got other things to focus on, at least in accordance to, those making decisions. So.
Thank you. We have another question. We have time for one more.
Sorry, I was a downer on EVs. I'm really excited about them, but I'm really afraid that we're not ready for them. So.
All right, well, we'll end on a fun one in Jigyasa. And maybe the tiebreaker here. There's lots to unpack here, but just to end on a little bit different note. Austin, San Antonio, let's settle the taco and the barbecue debate. Final. Oh, Houston, do we have comments?
I got out of that Austin, San Antonio taco debate about a year and a half ago, but yeah, Houston might have it better, dude. So.
All right, here we go.
All right, Jigyasa, how about you leave us some final thoughts that we can take back to put action on, yeah. And if you have a taco or
Yeah.
barbecue recommendation. Feel free.
Well, I don't. This is my first time in Texas, and I'm already like, why am I flying out today? I should have stayed back. So you guys need to invite me again so that I can be here again. But actually, my takeaway was something related to yoga that I totally forgot about. But I think, oh yeah, it was this that I was discussing with Lee actually, that, I think I'm going to write, this is my next article, so no one writes this, but it's what smart cities can learn from yoga. So I think the other piece of wisdom I want to share is that, much like how yoga is a practice, I think achieving resiliency is more sort of a practice. It's more of a journey. I don't think there is like a point where you can be like, yay, we are now resilient. But it's sort of like, how do you balance the different aspects of urban resiliency that I touched upon earlier? I think that is the key, and it's just like a resilient city is a work in progress. I think that's what it is. So, yeah.
Can I just want to give kudos to John. John's done a lot of work statewide to bring a lot of voices together on the topic of broadband connectivity. I don't know if we would be where we are with state focus and state investment on digital equity if it wasn't for the work of John. So I just want to give him kudos before we step away from here.
Thank you, John. All right, well, thank you so much, the panel, and I believe we're taking a quick break. Thank you so much.